You're an INFJ. Chances are people call you an old soul. You feel emotions deeply. You sense others' pain and carry it quietly. By 25, you feel centuries older than your birth certificate claims. Why? Today we unpack why INFJs feel older than their age, not philosophically, but biologically. We'll see how chronic empathy and self-control change your brain and body. And by the end, you'll understand how to reclaim youthfulness even as you stay your authentic self. Section 1, INFJ traits and hyper-responsibility. INFJs are known for deep empathy and insight into others' psychology. In personality research, they often score high on empathy and conscientiousness. This means you're tuned to social nuances from a young age. Psychologists note such high empathy people often take on extra responsibility, compensating for others' needs. Every slight misstep around you demands silent remediation. Over years, this builds emotional gray hairs. Neurologically, cognitive empathy involves mentalizing networks like the medial prefrontal cortex. These consume energy every time you guess someone's thoughts. A meta-analysis found that taking others' perspectives raises prefrontal metabolic demand, akin to heavy lifting for your brain. Chronically, this persistent brain work can feel mentally exhausting, as if your brain ages faster. Attachment influences this drive. If as a child you learned security required tuning into caregivers, common for highly empathetic people, your brain became wired for hypervigilance. Mikulincer and Shavert explain that anxious attachment leads to a chronic intensification of emotions, while avoidant attachment suppresses needs. Either way, you learn to read the room constantly. An empirical study found that people high in attachment anxiety exhibit constant vigilance and hypersensitivity to cues of rejection, chronically activating stress responses. Thus, your old soul wisdom has roots in survival conditioning, leaving physiological footprints that mimic accelerated aging. Section 2, the dorsal vagal freeze response. High empathy adults often default to the freeze response under stress. Porges' polyvagal theory shows that beyond fight or flight, sympathetic arousal, there is a dorsal vagal freeze, a parasympathetic shutdown. Outwardly, you might look composed or even sleepy. Inwardly, your amygdala and stress hormones are raging. Neuroscience shows freeze involves co-activation. High cortisol with behavioral immobility. This conserves energy when fight-flight feels too risky. For INFJs, freeze often feels like internal alert, external stillness. You don't lash out or flee. Instead, you absorb. Research indicates freeze states maintain heightened amygdala and insula activity despite calm facades. In practical terms, your body is quietly burning fuel. Metabolically and neurologically, living chronically in partial freeze is hard. Over time, this can mirror the damage of chronic stress, elevated baseline stress markers, poorer immune markers, and cognitive fatigue. That's why INFJs might age from the inside out, feeling heavy with silent tension. If this resonates, you're not imagining it. Your brain is wired to protect, but protective wiring is costly. Stay with us. Next, we'll map how these internal states fuel rumination networks that age you further. Rest is rarely restful for you. The default mode network, DMN, kicks in when the mind wanders or ruminates. Studies find that individuals prone to rumination show stronger DMN connectivity. In high empathy types, this means the mind replays social interactions obsessively. Clinical evidence links rumination to mental health aging. A 2013 meta-analysis reported that repetitive self-focused thinking robustly predicts both depression and anxiety. For an INFJ, a simple, awkward conversation can loop in your mind for days. Neurologically, this keeps the DMN perpetually on, wasting cognitive energy. Over years, the constant activation of brain circuits tied to stress and aging, like the HPA axis, can simulate a faster internal clock. Rumination also affects memory. Focus on others' problems impairs your self-attention. Research shows strong DMN activity correlates with slower switching to active tasks. You may feel slower, more world-weary, as your brain is fatigued by non-stop reflection. It's as if your nervous system thinks you're still in the struggles of adolescence or young adulthood, never quite letting you relax into your actual age. Your role often becomes the caregiver's caregiver. This is emotional labor, managing feelings to meet others' expectations. Original research by Hochschild, 1983, identified this in service workers, but it applies to anyone constantly faking calm. You perform surface acting. You appear kind or understanding even when you're exhausted inside. Decades of research show surface acting is costly. For instance, an occupational health study found surface acting positively correlated with burnout rates. In plain terms, the more you fake your emotions, the more your energy depletes. Constantly explaining away others' faults prevents conflict, but it also invalidates your reality. You internalize fatigue. This emotional labor bleeds into identity. Each day you prioritize others' comfort over your own breaks down your sense of self. Neurobiologically, chronic self-suppression has health costs. Smith found expressive suppression led to higher blood pressure and stress hormones versus control. Physically feeling older can follow from feeling unseen emotionally. In effect, your life becomes invisible labor. It ages you quietly, making you feel old while outwardly nothing changed. Section 5, moral injury and conscience burnout. Violating your own ethics adds weight. INFJs often have strict internal compasses. When you stay silent to avoid confrontation, you may feel you're betraying yourself. Neurologically, this cognitive dissonance lights up conflict processing centers, ACC insula, and boosts stress hormones. Research in high conscience populations finds moral injury significantly ups depression and suicide risk. For example, one study showed people with probable moral injury had 3x odds of current suicidal ideation. Each compromise erodes your integrity, contributing to conscience burnout. Physically, moral conflict triggers the same chronic stress patterns as trauma. Over years, carrying this silent guilt wears you down. It's like dragging an invisible weight that accelerates fatigue and age-related wear. If you've made it here, you're clearly seeking answers. You're diagnosing your own pattern. The good news, neuroplasticity means change is possible. Next, we'll look at how suppression affects the brain and how to heal it, turning wisdom into a strength, not a burden. Section 6, physiology of suppression and rewiring. Studies vividly show that suppression backfires. In growth, people hiding emotions showed higher heart rate and blood pressure than expressive peers. That's because emotion isn't extinguished by silence, it bursts inward. A neural imaging study found that suppression failed to dampen limbic activity. Amygdala responses remained high, even showing increased insula firing. Essentially, your brain paid for your composure. Over time, these patterns cement into wiring. Chronic suppression strengthens amygdala prefrontal loops, favoring vigilance. But the brain can remap. Expressive writing research by Pennebaker found that brief emotional disclosure led to long-term health gains, reduced physician visits, and improved immune markers compared to controls. This indicates that processing feelings physically changes physiology. In practical terms, if you practice regulated expression, journaling, therapy, close talks, you engage ventromedial prefrontal cortex control and calm the amygdala. Neuroscience now shows that learning to articulate emotions actually thickens prefrontal cortex regions involved in self-soothing. In other words, your old soul insight can evolve from inward collapse to balanced strength. You'll still feel empathy, but it won't cost you your inner peace. INFJ, your sensitivity is a superpower, not a flaw. The cost of your empathy comes from outdated survival patterns, not personal failing. You don't need to become harder or quieter. Many INFJs feel mentally older because they have already lived so much of life inside their minds. Chronic future simulation creates a kind of internal fast-forward effect. Research on episodic future thinking shows that imagining the future activates the same default mode network circuits as recalling the past, particularly regions such as the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex. Neurologically, the brain treats vivid simulation almost like lived experience. When you repeatedly project 10 years ahead, rehearse possible conversations, or anticipate emotional outcomes before they occur, you accumulate cognitive mileage without chronological years passing. This sustained future processing is metabolically demanding and contributes to subjective time compression. You feel older not because life has happened, but because your mind has already processed it. Another pathway emerges from early responsibility. Many highly empathetic children experience some degree of parentification, where they take on emotional or practical roles beyond their stage. Research links childhood parentification with elevated cortisol levels and long-term stress dysregulation in adulthood. What appears externally as maturity is often chronic adaptation. When a child learns to regulate adults, soothe siblings, or stabilize chaotic environments, the nervous system shifts into sustained vigilance. The body becomes calibrated for responsibility rather than play. Over time, this conditioning creates a persistent adult mode identity that lingers long after the original circumstances have ended. The result is a felt sense of having grown up too quickly, as if youth was abbreviated rather than completed. Cognitive load further compounds this aging effect. High empathy individuals make an extraordinary number of micro-decisions daily, evaluating tone, predicting impact, editing language, anticipating misunderstandings. Each decision draws on executive function. Ego depletion research suggests that repeated acts of self-control and decision-making reduce subsequent regulatory capacity. Even if later models nuance ego depletion theory, the broader literature on cognitive load confirms that executive resources are finite. When the prefrontal cortex remains constantly engaged in social calculation, mental fatigue accumulates. Over time, decision fatigue resembles aspects of cognitive aging, slower switching, reduced tolerance for ambiguity, and increased error under pressure. The exhaustion feels like age, even when biological age remains unchanged. Loss of play adds another layer. Play is not frivolous, it is neurobiologically restorative. Research in effective neuroscience indicates that play activates dopaminergic reward pathways and supports oxytocin-mediated bonding processes, both of which counteract chronic stress responses. INFJs, however, often prioritize reflection and responsibility over spontaneous enjoyment. When play is consistently deprioritized, stress hormones are not offset by sufficient reward activation. Without those periodic neurochemical resets, baseline stress remains elevated. Chronic stress is strongly associated with markers of accelerated aging at both psychological and physiological levels. The absence of unstructured joy can therefore subtly intensify the sensation of being worn down, as though life has been experienced primarily as duty rather than exploration. Finally, many INFJs inhabit what can be described as an observer identity. They do not merely experience events, they watch themselves experiencing events. This meta-awareness, often linked to interoceptive sensitivity, recruits regions such as the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex. While reflective awareness can enhance insight, excessive self-monitoring fragments attention and sustains internal error detection signals. The brain remains partially in evaluation mode, scanning for missteps or misalignments. Living in this dual-layer consciousness, participating and simultaneously analyzing participation, creates continuous cognitive tension. Over time, that tension manifests as mental fatigue and the subjective impression of having carried more than one's chronological years would suggest. Taken together, chronic future simulation, early role reversal, constant executive decision-making, diminished play, and persistent self-observation form a reinforcing loop. Each mechanism independently taxes neural systems associated with stress regulation and executive control. Combined, they create a life experience with depth and intensity, but also with accumulated cognitive wear. The outcome is not literal aging, but the internal sensation of having traveled farther, thought longer, and carried more than most at the same age. Real growth is integration, knowing when to engage deeply and when to shield yourself. Remember, alignment, not age, is your goal. If this felt precise instead of dramatic, you belong on my off algorithm list. That's where I go deeper without dilution. Youth isn't lost, it's just hidden under layers of care and caution. Start by giving yourself permission to rest. Let others carry their own burdens sometimes. Speak up about small wrongs as practice. Each step eases your nervous system. The goal is to feel your years, not fight them. You've internalized a lifetime of empathy. Now it's time to internalize a little compassion for yourself. Your true age includes this wisdom and your well-being. It's all part of being the amazing INFJ you are. Integration, not suppression, is the true elder wisdom.